right. Welcome back for the final part of this deep dive into corruption in China.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Over these last couple episodes, we really dug into the history of this issue and brought it all the way to the present day.
Right, starting way back.
Exactly. And today, we're really going to zero in on how Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign has actually impacted the country's finances.
Mm. Hmm.
And I'm not just talking about anecdotes here. We actually have hard data.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we have this really fascinating source. It's a searchable database with every single corruption probe that was done in China between 2011 and 2016.
Really? Every single one?
That's right, thousands of cases.
Wow.
Each one's just meticulously documented.
It's a good gold mine.
It really is. Okay, so we've talked about how decentralization was supposed to, boost local economies,
Right.
but kind of unintentionally opened the door for more corruption.
Yeah, that was sort of the idea behind it, yeah.
So can you remind us about that? Like, what's the connection there?
Sure. So basically, local governments were given a ton of responsibility, right? Things like public services and building infrastructure.
Right.
But they had really limited ways to actually raise the money they needed to do all that.
I see. A problem.
Yeah, and that gap between all that responsibility and their resources created, well, a real breeding ground for, shall we say, some creative financing.
Interesting. So then enter Xi Jinping with that Tigers and Flies campaign.
Exact.
Could you remind us again what was so different about his approach?
Well, this time they went after everybody, from high-ranking tigers
Wow.
all the way down to those low-level bureaucrats, the flies.
Right.
This was really different from what they had done before, which was mainly focusing on that lower-level corruption.
Okay, and his crackdown, it was intense.
Incredibly so. Unprecedented, actually. I mean, the scope of this thing was huge.
And you were saying earlier that this crackdown actually had a pretty surprising impact on government revenue.
Oh, yeah. That's where this database really comes in.
But
Yeah, so researchers were able to use all this data and study this period from like 2012 to 2015.
okay.
And the thing is, what they found was fascinating. This anti-corruption campaign, at least in the short term, actually led to an increase in local government revenue.
Whoa, wait a minute. Cracking down on corruption actually brought in more money.
Yeah.
How does that even work?
Well, think about it. When corrupt officials are siphoning off funds, all that money, well, that's money that isn't going into the government's pocket.
Right.
By getting rid of those people, plugging those leaks, the government suddenly had more revenue from things like state-owned enterprises, business taxes, that sort of thing.
So it's like stopping the bleeding, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
But is that the whole story? I mean, there must be something else contributing to that revenue increase. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember all those tigers we were talking about?
Uh-uh.
Well, when they get caught, they usually have their assets seized.
Yeah.
I'm talking about serious money here, property, valuables, all those seizures, plus all the fines that they levied against these corrupt individuals. That created a whole new revenue stream for the government.
So it's like a 1-2 punch.
Pretty much.
Plugging the leaks and then generating this whole new income.
Yep. All because of the anti-corruption campaign.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and that's not even all of it. We also saw that these anti-corruption measures actually led to an increase in local government spending.
Spending? How so?
Yeah, so the data shows this noticeable uptick in spending by local governments after they started doing these really intense anti-corruption probes, and this was particularly in areas like education and public services.
So instead of just pocketing the extra cash, they actually put it back into programs.
It seems that way. And while it's hard to say for certain without looking into it further, it's very possible that some of this spending went toward things like anti-corruption education and awareness campaigns.
So maybe a preventative measure, like trying to stop corruption from happening in the first place.
Yeah, potentially. A long-term strategy. But it definitely fits with the whole message of this campaign, which is to change the culture surrounding corruption.
For sure.
Make it less acceptable. It's fascinating when you look at this data. It really challenges some assumptions about this whole thing.
What do you mean?
Well, a lot of people think tackling corruption is all about ethics, doing the right thing.
Right.
But this shows there can be really tangible economic benefits.
Yeah, like we were talking about before.
Exactly. Preventing those financial leaks,
Uh-huh.
creating this more stable environment for business.
But let's be real. A campaign this big, I mean, that's got to have some downsides, right? Come on.
Of course. Nothing's perfect, right?
Right.
There are always unintended consequences to these things. One concern is that focusing so much on punishing people, the individuals,
Yeah.
might actually distract from addressing those bigger systemic issues that allow corruption to thrive in the first place.
Hmm. It's like trimming the branches of a tree but not dealing with the roots,
Well,
right?
that's a great analogy.
You might see some improvement,
Yeah.
but the problem will just keep coming back.
Exactly. So the question is, what are those deeper roots in the Chinese context?
Yeah, what are they?
Well, it's complicated, honestly. It's this
Yeah.
mix of historical legacies, political structures, economic incentives, even cultural norms.
Wow, that's a lot.
It really is.
Well, let's start with the big one, the elephant in the room.
Okay.
China's one-party political system.
Yeah.
How does that contribute to the problem?
Well, you have to think about it this way. In any system where you have power concentrated in the hands of a few,
Uh-huh,
you always run the risk of abuse.
right?
And without strong systems for accountability, transparency,
Yeah.
that risk just gets magnified.
So even with Xi Jinping's best intentions, it's still an uphill battle.
Exactly.
If the system itself is built in a way that allows for this abuse of power.
You got it. And then you have to factor in the insane pace of China's economic development,
Oh, yeah.
that kind of breakneck growth.
Yeah.
That always creates opportunities for corruption, especially when regulations and oversight can't keep up.
It's like the Wild West.
I was just thinking that.
Fortunes being made left and right.
Right.
Rules being bent, corners being cut.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. That kind of environment, it just breeds corruption.
Oh, for sure.
But is there more to it? Like, are there any other factors at play here?
Yeah, we can't forget about the cultural aspect of all of this.
Oh, interesting.
In some societies, things like gift giving and personal connections, that's just how business is done.
Okay.
But it can make it really hard to see where the line is,
Between what's acceptable and what's considered corruption.
Right.
Now, it's not always this black and white issue.
Not at all.
There are a lot of gray areas here, cultural nuances, historical baggage.
It's what makes this whole issue so complex.
For sure. So it sounds like to really solve this problem, you'd need to take a multi-pronged approach, right?
Absolutely. It's not enough to just punish people after the fact. You have to strengthen institutions, promote transparency,
Okay.
foster a culture of accountability, and try to address those underlying economic and social conditions.
That allow corruption to happen in the first place.
Exactly.
So a pretty monumental task.
Especially in a country as big and complex as China. Yeah, it's a huge undertaking.
Yeah. But it's got to be worth it, right? I mean, the stakes are so high.
Oh, they are, definitely. Corruption undermines public trust, it erodes the rule of law, and it holds back economic development. It can really eat away at the very fabric of society if you let it.
So where does that leave us? I mean, what does the future hold for China's fight against corruption?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
Is this just a temporary crackdown, or are we seeing a real change here? It's hard to say for sure,
Right.
but there are some encouraging signs, I mean, think about it. The fact that this campaign has gone after such high-level officials, the tigers,
Uh-huh.
I mean, that tells me that Xi Jinping is serious about tackling this problem.
And the fact that they are seeing some positive results, at least with the finances.
Right. That gives them even more incentive to keep going.
Exactly.
Right.
But you also said earlier that corruption is a really deeply entrenched problem.
Oh, yeah. It's not going to go away overnight.
No.
It's going to take sustained effort, political will, and a willingness to address those root causes that we talked about.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. So do I think it's been successful so far?
Yeah.
Well, even if it doesn't completely wipe out corruption, it's sent a very clear message
Which is?
that it's not going to be tolerated, at least not on the scale we've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. That is a pretty significant shift.
I think so.
It's a step towards a more transparent, accountable, and equitable China.
Right.
And that's a good thing for everyone, right?
Absolutely, not just within China, but for the whole global community.
That's a good point, actually. This brings up something really important.
What's that?
How China's actions on this front, with corruption, how that actually impacts the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is a global issue, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, look, China is a global powerhouse, both economically and politically.
Right.
So whatever happens there, it has ripple effects all over the world.
That's true. So how does this anti-corruption drive impact other countries? And what can the rest of the world learn from what China is doing?
Well, I think it's important to start with the economic side of things,
Okay.
China cracking down on corruption, well, that could lead to a much more stable business environment,
Right.
one that is more predictable and, that could make China even more attractive for foreign investment.
So everybody wins. Right.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, more investment means more growth, more jobs, better living standards.
Right. But some people are saying that China's campaign could actually make things harder for businesses, at least in the short term.
Yeah, that's a concern for sure.
But how? I mean, if things are more transparent, shouldn't it be easier to do business there?
Well, yeah, in theory, but you have to remember, when you crack down on corruption, you're disrupting these networks and practices that have been in place for a long time, even if they are corrupt. And that can create a lot of uncertainty for businesses, especially ones that are used to operating in a system that's more, well, opaque, I guess you could say.
So it's like a trade-off, right?
I think so.
You're trying to build a better system, but there are going to be some bumps along the way.
Exactly. There will be some growing pains.
For sure. And then you also have to think about how this whole thing looks to other countries, geopolitically.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Some people see this anti-corruption campaign as, well, a power grab, a way for Xi Jinping to consolidate his control and eliminate his rivals.
Right. Some critics are saying it's not really about cleaning up corruption at all,
but about strengthening the Communist Party's grip on power.
Exactly. And whether it's true or not, that perception can create a lot of tension and mistrust on the world stage. It doesn't really help China when they are trying to present themselves as this, responsible global leader.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like they're walking a really fine line.
For sure.
Trying to balance transparency and fairness with their own political system and values.
It's a tough position to be in.
Yeah. So could China's model be exported to other countries? I mean, could this work somewhere else?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. I mean, some aspects of it, like having a strong leader who takes decisive action, well, that could be adaptable to other contexts. But there are other elements like the lack of judicial independence, the limits on free speech.
Yeah.
Those are really at odds with democratic values.
Right, so it's not one size fits all.
Definitely not. Every country has to find its own way. But there are still things other countries can learn from China's experience.
Like what?
Well, for example, China's use of technology, how they use it to track and expose corruption. That's something other countries could definitely look into.
Yeah.
And then you have the fact that their efforts have actually had a tangible impact,
Yeah.
Less corruption, more government revenue.
That's definitely something other countries would want to replicate.
For sure. So, those are just a few things to consider.
Are there any other, key takeaways or strategies, if a country wanted to try to tackle this issue?
Yeah, I think the most important lesson here is that this isn't a quick fix. This is a long game. You need a long-term commitment, and you have to address this issue from multiple angles.
So it's about creating a system that just makes it harder for corruption to happen in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to something we discussed earlier. Is this a temporary crackdown, or is China actually changing? Are they becoming more transparent, more accountable?
Right, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. We don't have a crystal ball, so it's impossible to say for sure.
Right.
But one thing is certain, the world is watching China very closely right now. What happens there matters, not just for China, but for all of us.
Very true. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dives into corruption in China.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. It's a fascinating, complex issue, full of contradictions.
Yeah, definitely.
But hopefully our conversation has helped shed some light on this global problem.
Yeah, and helped people understand the challenges.
And maybe even see some potential solutions.
That's the goal, at least. I mean, at the end of the day, fighting corruption is really about fighting for a fairer, more just world.
Absolutely. It's a fight that we should all be a part of.
Yeah, it doesn't matter where you live, what kind of government you have. This is something that affects all of us.
That's a great point. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep exploring these complex issues.
Always.
Thanks for listening.